Hello, everyone. We are honored to have Dr. Bernard Harcourt with us today. Bernard Harcourt is a distinguished critical theorist, legal advocate, and a prolific writer and editor. He's a professor of law and political thought at Columbia University. Before joining Columbia, he taught at the University of Chicago. He was also a visiting professor at Harvard University, New York University, and the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's also the director of the School for Advanced Studies in Social Sciences in Paris. He's the author and editor of more than a dozen books. Some of most famous books are Counter-Revolution, How Our Government Went to War Against Its Own Citizens, The Illusion of Free Markets, Punishment and the Myth of Natural Order, Occupy, Three Inquiries into Disobedience, and he has also edited and annotated many volumes of Michel Foucault's lectures in English and French. And today we are here to talk about his magnum opus, Critique and Praxis, Philosophy of Illusions, Values, and Actions, published in 2020 by Columbia University Press. Bernard, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Morteza, for having me.
Pleasure. Let us start with how this book was conceived. There is this wonderful quote from you in the book, which says that the book was born out of a turmoil because you're a lawyer who's been fighting for justice. So that's the praxis side of your life. And at the same time, you're also a theorist and a professor of law and political thought. And that's the critical theory side. So how did you bring these two together? And what was the point, the inception point of this book?
Right. Yeah. Born out of frustration in the sense that so often when I'm engaged in legal practice, when I'm engaged in litigation on behalf of someone on death row or someone at Guantanamo, I kind of put aside my critical theory side and all I use are the legal tools, which is an entirely different discourse, an entirely different repertoire of arguments. It's about due process. It's about justice and fairness and whatnot. But it doesn't have it doesn't intersect really with critical theory and with questions of legitimation and all of the kind of the tools of critical theory. I often felt like I had to just put them aside in order to try and achieve the result I was trying to achieve in one of these cases, in order to advance the interests of someone on death row, to get them off of death row, etc. And the reason is that, I mean, when you're doing that kind of work and litigation or even organizing, political organizing, there's so many strategic considerations, and there's a language to speak which is very different than the language of critical theory. And so so it's that frustration that kind of throughout my career as a social justice litigator has kind of recurringly come up. It's conflict of like, well, wait a minute, you know, how exactly, how could I speak differently to a judge or a jury? And very often it's just not possible to speak the language of critical theory, right? It's not going to be heard. It's not going to be understood. And it's not going to be well received. And so it's that constant kind of tension and contradiction that led me to try to find a way to put these in communication, really. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a good point you mentioned about how critical theory or that language is not well received, which is something we'll come up to later on. Let us start with a definition. Critical theory is usually, when tracing back the origins of critical theory, we usually start with Frankfurt School, maybe, but you take it back to the 19th century.
Right.
So could you expand on that point?
Yeah, sure. I think it's right. I mean, I'm not using the term critical theory in the limited kind of capitalized C, capitalized T that is generally associated with the Frankfurt School. So many people, when they think critical theory, they think exclusively of the Frankfurt School, starting in the 1920s and the 1930s with Horkheimer and Adorno, going through the different generations of critical theory and of the Frankfurt School through Jürgen Habermas to Axel Honneth, and today perhaps Martin Zarr or others. Often those generational notions of the Frankfurt School are based on actually the professorial chair that that Horkheimer had, and then that Habermas had. And so I'm thinking instead of critical theory much more broadly, so that it can include thinkers who typically are described as post-structuralists, like thinkers like Michel Foucault or Gilles Deleuze, or contemporary post-colonial thought, so Gayatri Spivak or Edward Said, queer theory today, critical race theory today. I think those are all critical theory. Sometimes I refer to it as kind of critical thought because I don't want to get misunderstood. I don't want people to limit the term. Now, when you think about it more broadly in that vein, you're thinking about a way of thinking that has particular dimensions. One is a notion of reflexivity. So this idea that actually the critical thinker has to understand their own position in history and in society at a particular moment as shaping the way they think and as having certain effects on the critical theory and praxis that they're going to be engaged in. So there's a notion of reflexivity. There's also a notion of trying to disenchant the world of certain illusions and ideologies. And that's very common to someone like Michel Foucault, who spent a lot of time talking about the notion of regimes of truth rather than solid or objective truth. And those notions of regime of truth are very similar to notions of ideology or illusions that others might use. Freud used the notion of illusion a lot, the future of an illusion, for instance. So there are certain dimensions that all of this thinking has in common. It's a counterintuitive type of thought that tries to show the way in which kind of mentalities, ideas shape our understanding of the world and distort our understanding of the world. So they need to be, in a way, unveiled. Right now, I think that that is a common way of thinking to the Frankfurt School and Foucault and Deleuze and others, and Spivak and Said and Judith Butler. And I think, though, that it also traces back to the 19th century. It traces back to the three great thinkers from the 19th century who developed a hermeneutics of suspicion, as many refer to it, Paul Ricoeur and others. The hermeneutics of suspicion, the hermeneutics that what we see and what we believe may be actually distorting. It may be a false consciousness. It may be an illusion that is not actually getting at what is making things happen in society. Those great thinkers from the 19th century, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, really, I think I trace critical theory back to them, and particularly to Marx and to Marx's idea that our role is not simply to interpret the world, but to change it. And I think that's the source, really. How to change it depends on interpreting it, but it depends on having a certain understanding of the place of ideas and imagination and illusions, right? But then also focusing on changing the world, actually. So I draw a longer arc from the 19th century all the way to the present when I think about and talk about critical theory.
Thank you. And I guess what makes this book really readable and accessible is that you're trying to, you're actually trying to put into practice what Marx said to works of philosophy is to change the world. And you have used a lot of your personal anecdotes and your personal experience in the book. And what you mentioned about hermeneutics of suspicion is a perfect segue into my next question. I come from a literary background, and in literature, yeah, we love critical theory. We love that abstract language, that postmodern language. But more recently, there has been a turn to something we call post-critique, which is trying to get over that idea of negativity, that hermeneutics of suspicion that has marked literary studies. And we're going back to the text to study the text itself. It's not to completely disregard the social, political, or economic context, but in a way, revival of the text, revival of sentimentality and affect. And I guess part of the reason is that critical theory has always been enshrined with this negativity.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know why, but people, I mean, the language has become so abstract, so abstruse. It has been detached from the public sphere.
Right.
Critical theory has been more and more pushed into academic sphere. And there was this great article from Bruno Latour, which you have also included in your book, Why Critique Has Run Out of Steam, where he mentions that even critique has become a weapon in the hands of conservatives or right-wingers, conspiracy theorists. And I guess last month there was this summit of national conservatives. I don't remember the name. There were all those high-profile conservatives in the States. And one of them, Hersey Ali, I guess, said that the professor is the enemy.
Right.
You know, what she was referring to was, of course, critical theory. And what is it about critical theory that is so much hated, and why has it been detached from the public sphere, from Praxis, where it's supposed to actually have its influence?
Right.
And what is the way out of it?
Yeah. So those are great questions, Morteza, and animating questions for me. And you've raised a number of issues. So let me try and touch on as many of them as possible. You're entirely right that critical theory tends to be associated mostly with the critique and not with any form of kind of reconstruction, right? You're also absolutely right that critical theory, in a way, kind of retreated into the academy. It used to be more of a public discourse, and now it retreated into the academy, and not only into the academy, but into certain more specialized and highly theorized and jargonized disciplines in the academy, such as rhetoric and English departments. And as a result, a lot of the contemporary critical theory is almost inaccessible to someone who hasn't had a doctoral training in criticism. Those are all the problems, in a way, that I'm trying to address and redress with this intervention. Another way to phrase this is that critical theory became associated more and more with the idea of crisis and critique, rather than critique and praxis. So kind of diagnosing crises and doing fancy critical moves, rather than thinking critically and figuring out what is to be done, what the praxis side of things. Now, I think that you're right that there is a certain frustration as a result. A movement in some disciplines, in English, for instance, and in literature, towards what's called more surface readings, right? And getting rid of this idea that there's always something hidden, or that you always have to kind of expose the hidden character of something, but instead to do more surface readings, to be less skeptical, and in part, some of this, I think, is a reflection of the fact that, you know, we've seen a rise of authoritarianism in a country like the United States, with the election and 4 years in office of Donald Trump, and very explicit forms of racism, xenophobia, sexism, so explicit, in fact, that you don't really need much critical theory to expose it. And so a lot of people feeling like, I don't need to spend a lot of time trying to decipher Horkheimer and Adorno's dialectic of enlightenment to try and understand what's going on today, because it's like it's really blatantly racist and sexist and homophobic, and I can see it. I don't need to be doing any fancy jumps, right? And so all of those things, I think, have led to a certain frustration with critical theory. What I tried to do in the book is to resuscitate the interest in critique and praxis, and to move critical theory back towards the questions of what is to be done, although I take that in a particular direction, which we can talk about later. It's not so much what is to be done, but what more am I to do? We can talk about that later. But here on this question, I just want to try and get at the heart of your question, which is, why not stop with the kind of negativity or criticality, and instead engage in more surface reading of the world, right? And the answer there is that despite the fact that critical theory became more academic and jargonized and whatnot, the core idea in critical theory remains entirely correct, I would say. And the core idea is that the way that we see the world, the lens, the intellectual, the mentalities, our understanding of the world is very much influenced by certain beliefs and ideas that we hold on to that are actually that are actually distorting how we understand the world. And you can take any example in any debate, but I think if we're talking about issues of transgender rights, for instance, which is a big topic in the United States because of forms of discrimination against transgender persons, in order to kind of figure out how to address those problems, the first thing you have to understand is what are our conceptions of gender, right? What are our conceptions of the role of men or women, or how they are supposed to interact? Where does that come from? What are those preconceived notions and ideas that we have? And if we don't dig down into those and try to address those, understand those, and most of the time kind of unveil illusions about that, I think it's going to be impossible to make any headway in praxis in addressing what is to be done. And this is true for in the context of race and critical race theory today, in the context of gender and questions of sexuality, in practically every dimension where there's an important issue to deal with, whether it's in the context of the prison and the need for abolition. There are certain kind of preconceived ideas that in a way are distorting the conversation and need to be addressed. And that's where critical theory is so important. It's the relationship to the objective world. The idea essentially is that there isn't just an objective world out there that has truth and reality to it, and we can just see it. The fact is that whatever we see is filtered through our conceptions, for instance, of race. What is race? Does race and what is anti-racism? Those ideas are shaped by certain histories. And unless we understand that, do the work of unveiling some of these illusions, it's impossible to get to the point where we can figure out what we should be doing in any of these political struggles. And so that's why I think it's important to modify, rethink, and render accessible critical thought. Yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned that critique has always been associated with crisis. If there is a crisis, there's a critique, and it reminded me of, if I'm pronouncing the author's incorrectly, Reinhard Koselleck's book, Critique and Crisis,
Yes.
which he wrote in 1950s. And you've also quoted from Reinhard in your book. I read that book a long time ago. I'm not really, I mean, it's kind of blurring in my mind, but if I'm not mistaken, his idea was that critique was also at the heart of all these changes in society, but it became more metaphysical, more abstract with Kant. But like I said, I read the book a long time ago, and it's kind of blurring in my mind at the moment.
Right.
And
Well,
yeah,
go ahead. I mean, the book is important because, I mean, it helps trace the notion of critical theory back to crisis moments. So the root word for critical in critical theory goes back to the same root word for crisis. And critical theory generally happens at critical moments, a moment of medical crisis, or a moment of societal crisis. And a lot of critical theory ended up being diagnostic in the sense of trying to understand crises properly. And that's very important work. As you know, a lot of critical theory was trying to understand the rise of totalitarianism during the 1930s and 20s and 30s. I mean, at mid 20th century. And that is essential work, because it's this idea of trying to unveil illusions, but you just can't stop there. That's my point. If all we do is diagnose crises and understand the present, then we've only done the preliminary work of critical theory. Because the most important thing, again, going back to a thinker like Marx, is to change the world, not just to understand it, not just to diagnose it, and not just to engage in crisis analysis. It's to actually change the world. And so, you know, that idea of crisis and critique is just one moment of what critical theory should be about. But I'm sorry, I interrupted you because you were going to take us somewhere else.
no, I just wanted to mention this because this is such a great book, as you mentioned, and because it was written in the 1950s and it was written in German. I don't know when it was translated into English, but it's kind of a book that is forgotten. And I always feel great when I see that the book has been cited or has been brought more into attention. And am I right to assume that Chomsky's critique of the French intellectuals is that they have also lost the praxis side, and they've also become so much, bogged down in that theoretical quagmire? Oh, and I'm also thinking of Edward Said, because Edward Said was a great, and I love the works of Edward Said and also his life, because he was a critical theorist. At the same time, he was very much into praxis, the cause of the Palestinian cause, and
Right.
he paid a heavy price for that as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that there have often been criticisms of contemporary critical thought for not paying sufficient attention to class conflict. So here you have to understand something, is that, I mean, within this broader field of critical theory that I'm trying to understand and think about. So that's not just the Frankfurt School, which was born from a kind of Marxist, from a Marxist critique of Marx in a way. But within this big picture of critical theory, Marx looms very large, but represents one particular way of thinking about how we need to transform the world, focused on issues of class and distribution and political economy. I would say that it's not just the French thinkers, but part of, let's say, the 1980s and 90s in critical theory, and for instance, Judith Butler's work, focused on particular dimensions of our personal identity, whether it was a sexuality or gender or race, that then, in a way, came into tension with the class focus of Marxism and of more Marxist-oriented critical thinkers. And so there was and the result is a big tension within critical theory between some more Marxist-oriented or class-oriented or political economy-oriented critical thinkers who think that the major issue is distribution, work-related issues, right? Versus other critical thinkers, some critical race theorists, some feminist critical thinkers, etc., who also think that those dimensions are very important and need to be addressed. And maybe even that they give us a special purchase on systems of oppression, right? So then the result is that you have certain thinkers, such as maybe Chomsky, but certainly Richard Rorty, for instance, who I would consider a critical thinker, but who is very opposed, very angry at someone like Foucault for drawing our attention to questions of sexuality, because he, Rorty, really wanted the left to be focused on class and work issues, right? And so, you know, you're familiar, I'm sure you're familiar with this tension. It's referred to today through the lens of identity politics, right? And in the 1990s, there was a large debate over kind of redistribution versus recognition of identitarian differences. That has existed in critical theory for decades, that tension, I would say. And I would say it's a bit unfortunate, but and resolvable, because I don't think ultimately that these questions are a zero-sum game, that if you're paying attention to class, then you're not paying attention to race and gender and sexuality, or if you're paying attention to sexuality, then you're not paying attention to class. There are ways for critical theory to engage in very rich, thoughtful consideration of how race relates to class. And so in some recent seminars, we've been discussing, this is the new series, my new 13 series, it's called Revolution 1313, and the last one was on the Combahee River Collective Statement from 1977. And that was a statement by Black women, Black feminists, who argued there, actually that was the first text that used the term identity politics. It's a brilliant statement, it's a brilliant text, but it used it in a very nuanced way to talk about the way in which they had been brought to political action. and the way in which they were situated in a particular space in society as Black women, and the way in which those dimensions of identity, if we put them at the center, can help us formulate ways of addressing oppression that would protect everyone, right? And so I think they offer, for instance, a very nuanced and careful analysis of identity politics that tries to avoid the either or, and to bring these dimensions of oppression, but also dimensions of liberation together.
Thank you. Some time ago, I listened to a lecture by Vivek Chiber, who he loves the works of Edward Said, but at the same time, he's very critical of his work. And that was the main critique that he had, that he blamed, maybe not so much Edward Said himself, because Edward Said was a secular humanist himself, but the followers of Edward Said took the attention away from class conflict to identity politics, like you mentioned, but these are resolvable, as you have mentioned. But unfortunately, there is this conflict within critical theories as well. And that is, yeah.
Go ahead, sorry. Yeah.
There are two great chapters in the book. I mean, there are a lot of great chapters, but two of them specifically stood out. One of them was Getting Beyond Truth, and I love the argument in that chapter. But it could sometimes also be misleading if it's not put in the right context, because you make the argument that if we have a claim to truth, that could be misleading. But so I'm trying, I would love you to expand on that. And also, doesn't it, and maybe clarify the point, that doesn't it run the risk of being open to the idea of, the whole idea of post-truth or alternative fact? So what is it about truth and a claim to truth from a
right. Yeah, no, thanks for focusing our attention to that, because I think it's really important. And it's also very complicated, and so not easy to package in a sentence or two. I think it requires a lot of thinking and a lot of care. It's a very delicate matter. Now, it's delicate in the sense that, we need to think about this in a deep way without jumping to conclusions too quickly, or without reducing things too much, because it's when it gets reduced, I think, that we start going down simplistic paths like post-truth or something like that, or the dangers of post-truth. So what I'm trying to suggest there in that chapter is that it's oftentimes when we are firmly convinced of the truth of propositions that we actually act in the most dangerous ways. I think about the death penalty. It's only when we are certain that we sentence someone to death. And what I try to suggest in that chapter is that actually there aren't these levels of certainty that we tend to associate with truth. They just aren't there. We have theories, we have good evidence, we have good reasons to believe, we have strong evidence, we have unrebutted hypotheses, right? But truth, we actually never really have a kind of solid truth that is going to be unchangeable. And I think we see this throughout history. So I often wonder why it is that, what kind of arrogance do we have today to believe that we've understood something as being entirely true? But if you look throughout history, even in the physical sciences, right, the theory of relativity put into question some elements of the Newtonian physics, right? Newtonian physics was not true, and relativity is also something that at some point, some brilliant physician at some point will find a tweak, an error. I believe in climate change. I believe that it is humans and our industrialization and our emissions of carbons and other pollutants and other effects that have had an effect on the temperature of the Earth. Again, though, that's not truth. That is the best theory based on all of the evidence that we have. I'm willing to say that I'm going to act to reverse climate change based on that level of certainty, which is not 100%, but which is the most probable theoretical interpretation of the climate, given all of the evidence that we have. Now, you'll notice, that already sounds a little bit dangerous, right? Because it does mean that, there's some percent to which something is not true, but is the best theory we have. And of course, that is the wedge that can then be used to argue, wait a minute, so that's just, you don't believe in truth, you believe you're in a post-truth world. And I think one can be very careful in what one says. And we should be very careful in what we say, because when we claim truth, that's when I believe we engage in often the most dangerous actions.
I could see the lawyer side there, debating
Right.
the idea of truth. Very
Right.
good point. Thank you.
But actually the lawyer aspect is very important, because the legal model, the American legal model is a very good illustration of how we might want to think about truth. When a jury returns a verdict, they're actually not saying that that verdict is true. And it's only a simplification. It's only simplistic. It's naive to think that what they said was, this is the truth. What they said was, in a criminal case, they believe beyond a reasonable doubt. They don't have a reasonable doubt. They've looked at all the evidence. They're not saying it's 100% true. They're saying, we don't doubt that it's true based on all of the evidence. In a civil case, it's actually 51%. You only have to believe it's 51%. But that's very useful, because it's entirely right. It's not, a verdict is not the truth. A verdict is the best interpretation of the evidence, right? And I think that model could probably help us in understanding how to be more careful about truth claims.
It's an excellent example. Yeah, thank you. And I do love to talk about violence as well, because that I must say that chapter of the book was brought to my attention by a friend of mine who is working on the idea of violence in the Middle East.
Okay.
And I was also plagued with this liberal idea of violence, that violence is only physical harm or damage to people or properties. And you make this excellent point there, that this idea of violence could kind of veil or overshadow other forms of more symbolic violence that is being committed against people, such as poverty, homelessness, climate change. But it's not really recognized as a form of violence. So could you describe what that liberal idea of violence is, and how can we critically engage with that liberal idea of violence in order to hear the voices of the people, the global South, the people who are not in the Western world, and they're suffering, or pain is not really heard, maybe, or the voices are not really heard.
Yeah. I'm puzzled as to why we are so naive about violence still today, because there have been similar critiques over time. I'm not the first. I think that Walter Benjamin's critique of violence, worked in this direction as well, slightly differently, but here's the point, and I think it's hard to not think this is right. In a country like the United States, and in many countries, we tend to think of violence as physical violence, murder, robbery, street crime, violence. And that's how we define violence. And as long as people are not engaging in that violence, then we don't intervene. That is the liberal political theoretic foundation, really. But what it hides is all of the violence that is done to persons through structural mechanisms that deprive people of health insurance or deprive people of a living wage, right? All of the different ways in which distributions can result in life-threatening and life-harming consequences. And we never think of those distributions. We never think of those structures as violent because we don't see the physical violence. We don't see the direct violence. It's almost as if we are too simplistic. It's only if we can see, the hand hitting the person that we can understand a notion of harm. So, you can take any example of recent financial crisis or other crises. For instance, the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, which harmed thousands of people through lead poisoning, right? Those are forms of violence. But we don't think of them as violence. Or the Great Recession in 2008 had huge and devastating effects on people who lost their jobs, lost their health insurance in the United States. We don't have a universal health insurance in the United States. A lot of people lost their jobs, lost their health insurance, and many were, physically harmed by that, right? But we don't view it as physical harm. I think I think modern financialized neoliberal capitalism has fundamental consequences on people's lives, not only in the United States and in the centers of that political economy, Western Europe, etc., Japan, but also in the global South. And our policies regarding, say, IMF loans and what are required in kind of austerity measures and the Washington Consensus, those things have effects on people's lives. They change their lives. They could reduce their life expectancy. They can make it impossible for them to have healthcare, etc. And I think that we need to think about that through the lens of violence. I think the COVID experience, the pandemic experience, and the fact that these vaccines have been predominantly available in rich countries based on intellectual property laws, based on patents and legal private property mechanisms, means that those mechanisms are actually causing violence. The fact that in many countries that are poor and do not have access to the vaccines, that people are dying of COVID there, not because they're anti-vaxxers, but because there's just no way to get a vaccine. I think that is a form of violence, that we have to understand it as akin to physical violence. And until we are able to deconstruct that liberal physical violence notion, we're just never going to be able to properly transform society.
Yep, thank you. And I've taken much more of your time than I asked for, so I'll try to bring to an end with a final question, which is the most important one, I guess. There are different models for theory and praxis. I remember some time ago, I was talking to a friend of mine who was from India, and it was 4 or 5 years ago, and there was this strike in India, which was the largest strike in the world, but it didn't get enough media attention. And that friend of mine was very much into theory. And I told him, look, these people have maybe I've never ever heard of Adorno or Marx. These people, they are the people whose livelihood have been affected, and they're out there protesting. So there are different models for critique and praxis, critical theory and praxis, as if critical theory is a guide to praxis, or if it theorizes practice. You come up with a different model, which is critical praxis theory. So I was wondering if you could tell us what that is and give us some examples, especially in the light of the pandemic and more recent contemporary movements in the world, such as Arab Spring, Black Lives Matters, the Yellow Vest movement in Paris.
Okay, yeah, okay, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a good place to bring it all together. One of the most interesting questions for critical theory is ultimately how to relate critique and praxis. Is it that we engage in critical theory and in the process apply it in our practice? So does it come from critical theory as an application, or should we start with our practice and then try and understand it and theorize it, right? And there are different models that I try to trace in the book, but ultimately I argue that rather than having either critique or praxis as being kind of dominant and kind of shaping the other or leading to the other, we really need to think of them as constantly in confrontation, constantly confronting each other, so that our critical theory is challenging our praxis and our praxis is challenging our critical theory. It's a long argument, so it's hard to kind of boil it down, but I ultimately feel as if there can't be directionality, there needs to be constant clashing. And what that means is that we need to be engaging in action. It's never like we're going to know 100% from our critical theory what is the right way to act. So we need to act at times when because of these notions of truth, we're never going to have figured it out completely. But those actions are then going to need to shape our theorizing. One of the best examples actually is surprisingly is Foucault's work on prison abolition in the 1970s, beginning of the 1970s, where he was asked to engage in a kind of a truth commission or a kind of a popular tribunal to challenge the imprisonment of a lot of Maoist students, and his critical theoretic work made him think that actually no, the popular tribunal telling truth like that is not going to work, and so let's try instead to create a way for the persons who are incarcerated to speak and be heard, right? And so they created this group, Groupe d'information sur les prisons, and then of course that work then shaped his book, Discipline and Punish, and so that was where the praxis then transformed in part his theorizing. And I think that's a good example of the back and forth, the conflict, the tension. It shows you something that you then need to rethink or you need to react. And I think it's true in the, in many movements, there are discoveries and then there are challenges and there are things that we learn from them that we need to think about again. And Occupy Wall Street, I think, was really interesting in experimenting with leaderless movements, leaderless social movements. But as we saw in the Arab revolutions, those leaderless movements, which were in part inspired by Occupy, also had their problems and resulted in returns to more authoritarian regimes. So it's in the back and forth, I think, that that critical theory and critical praxis are most powerful in constantly reassessing and critically thinking about what it is that we're doing, but always asking ourselves, what more are we to do?
Dr. Bernard Harcourt, thank you very, very much for your time and this excellent, wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Morteza. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.